Okay, so we're going to dive into the Kushner family lore, and in this deep dive, I kind of want to give you guys just a rundown about who this family is and what their motivations are so that you can be more aware of how they have woven themselves and their corporations into different elements of society that affect all of us as well as our brothers and sisters overseas. So consider this deep dive a piece that lays the groundwork of who the Kushners really are. Might not get to every piece of information, every deal that the Kushner family has done, every corporation they own. There will be certain things that we touch on, but we will come back and dissect at a later date. But my hope for this deep dive is by the end of it, you have a better understanding of who the Kushner family is and what they're really using their influence to accomplish and how it negatively impacts all of us. So let's begin with a Kushner that we're all familiar with, Jared Kushner. Jared Corey Kushner was born on January 10th of 1981 in Livingston, New Jersey, to parents Cyril and Charles Kushner. Cyril and Charles have 4 children together, with Jared being the oldest, followed by his 3 younger siblings, Joshua, Dara, and Nicole. To understand Jared, we have to understand Charles Kushner. So let me pause on Jared and explain Charles Kushner a little bit. So Charles Kushner's parents, Jared's grandparents, were born in Poland and survived the reign of the Mustache Man by fleeing to Russia, the Soviet Union at the time. But in 1949, Charles Kushner's parents would leave the Soviet Union and immigrate to the United States. And at the time, Charles Kushner's father was not given permission to enter the United States and move to the United States, but his wife and her family, Charles's mother, Jared's grandmother, and her family were allowed to. So Charles Kushner's father falsified documents that stated that he and his wife were siblings, which is how he originally came to the United States. So the Kushners' American dream started through illegal immigration, yet now they're one of the wealthiest families in America trying to dismantle illegal and legal immigration into the United States. Isn't that interesting? I feel like that's such a pattern amongst this entire administration. When Charles Kushner's father came to the United States, he began working in construction. He would work his way up the ladder, living the American dream. He would eventually become a real estate investor and developer. So by the time that Charles Kushner was born, his father and his mother had built a very comfortable life to raise a family in the United States. Just as a side note, Charles Kushner was not born Charles Kushner. He was born Shannon Kushner, and he made the decision to change it to Charles. So Charles Kushner was already born into and was the heir of a up-and-coming real estate development empire that his father had began. So Jared Kushner and his siblings are not the first generation of Kushners to grow up with money. So Charles Kushner, after he grew up, got his law degree, he founded Kushner Companies in 1985. And with Kushner Companies, he would very quickly become one of the largest real estate developers in both New Jersey and New York. So that was just like a super duper speed run background of Charles Kushner. We will come back to him later in Jared's timeline. I just wanted to make it very clear that Charles Kushner is the son of immigrants who were able to live out the American dream against all odds, despite the Kushners wanting to take that ability away from anyone else. Also wanted to make it clear that Charles Kushner is not this scrappy entrepreneur. He was born into a real estate development empire, which obviously gave him a leg up into the industry. So Jared Kushner and his siblings were raised in a modern Orthodox Jewish family. They would attend very expensive private schools that were in line with their beliefs. In 1998, Charles Kushner made a donation of $2.5 million to Harvard University, and the following year, in 1999, Jared Kushner was accepted to Harvard University, which I'm sure is just a coincidence. Jared Kushner did the whole fraternity thing at Harvard, and he would go on to graduate in 2003 with a degree in government. While at Harvard, and obviously after, Jared began taking on tasks and working for his father at Kushner Companies, something that he continues to do in present day. One thing I think is important to note about this family dynamic is this family operates like a business. This family does not operate like the average working American family. These people operate like a business, very similar to how the Trump family is, which makes sense why Jared and Ivanka would get along so well. After Harvard, Jared began taking on a bigger role at Kushner Companies. Jared Kushner received his JD MBA dual degree in law and business after he would graduate from New York University School of Law as well as the New York University School of Business. So effectively, Jared Kushner was getting his higher education. He was managing millions of dollars worth of properties at Kushner Companies. And right around this time, he also began interning at the Manhattan District Attorney's Office. So he was stretched thin, to say the least. But in the midst of all of that, something else was happening within the Kushner family that caused Jared Kushner to have to step up in a way that he wasn't expecting to, as his father would be sentenced to prison time for crimes we're going to get into now. So in 2005, in the midst of Jared receiving his dual degree, Charles Kushner was convicted of 18 different criminal charges, including illegal campaign contributions, tax evasion, and witness tampering. Keep in mind, throughout this time, Charles Kushner is a registered Democrat, a friend of Bill and Hillary Clinton, a donor to Bill and Hillary Clinton, and many other Democratic candidates. When Charles Kushner found out he was being investigated by U.S. Attorney for the District of New Jersey, Chris Christie, he discovered that his sister was cooperating in this investigation, and that enraged him. To get revenge on his sister, Charles Kushner, a full-grown adult and father, hired a working woman to seduce his brother-in-law, his sister's husband, and had the entire encounter audio and video recorded, and he went on to send those recordings to his sister, perhaps as a way to retaliate, perhaps as a threat or a warning that he can make anything that she cares about go away if she goes against him. So obviously, that's where the witness tampering charge comes from. I think that whole situation, obviously it goes a lot deeper than what we're just touching on, but I think it just shows how cruel this man is capable of being if he feels that he was wronged. Charles Kushner was sentenced to 2 years in prison, ultimately just ended up serving over a year behind bars. He was subsequently disbarred from practicing law in New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania, which when you really get into the nitty-gritty of the crimes this man committed was a slap on the wrist. But I guess he felt that was worth ruining his relationship with his sister over forever. And as we know, down the line, circa 2020, Donald Trump gave Charles Kushner an unconditional pardon for these crimes, clearing his criminal record. So while Charles was dealing with his legal issues in, prison, Jared Kushner stepped up as CEO of Kushner Companies while getting his dual degree and while also interning at the District Attorney of Manhattan's office. One of the many reasons why I say this family operates like a business, not like a loving family. Because can you imagine expecting all of that of your child because you have to go to prison and you want to keep your money up? Ridiculous. So also while Jared Kushner's father was dealing with his legal issues, Jared Kushner purchased the New York Observer for $10 million because the wealthy are obsessed with having some kind of grip and control of the media and the narrative. With this purchase of the New York Observer, Jared Kushner drove out a lot of veteran journalists and editors who were not impressed with Jared's inability to lead, his lack of experience in journalism, and his obvious intention to want to use the Observer as a tool of propaganda to help create a reality that is flattering to the Kushner family and their many, many businesses. A few years after Jared Kushner purchased the Observer, he installed a man named Ken Kurson as editor-in-chief, and Ken Kurson is heavily affiliated with the Republican Party as a donor and a consultant, and he would later go on to be a pardon recipient from Donald Trump for his federal cyber-stalking convictions. The many journalists and editors who left the New York Observer whenever Jared Kushner took over were proven to be correct in their assumption that Jared Kushner wanted to use the New York Observer as a tool of propaganda after he was one of the very few major media publications to endorse Donald Trump in 2016 before ultimately joining the Trump administration as a senior advisor, handing over his ownership position to his brother-in-law, his sister's husband, Joseph Meyer. Now, rewinding back to when Jared first acquired the Observer. It was right around this time when Jared and Ivanka first met at a lunch arranged by a mutual friend, and they would ultimately go on to begin dating. At the point that Jared and Ivanka met, Daddy War Warbucks is out of prison. Jared has his myriad of degrees. He has the Observer, and he is effectively one of the most powerful and important people working within Kushner companies. Now, here's the point in the timeline where they just make it too easy for the conspiracy theorists. In 2007, Kushner companies purchased the 666 Fifth Avenue building in Manhattan for nearly $2 billion. This is the location of where the former Vanderbilt mansion used to stand, for anyone who's aware. This was a bad deal for the Kushners, and they would spend the following years selling off up to 49% stake in the building just to keep themselves out of enormous debt. Spoiler alert, the Kushner family would try to sell this building to the Qatari government in 2018. I mean, why not? The Qataris already own half of Manhattan as it is. But because he did this in 2018, while he was actively working in the Trump administration, this deal became very heavily scrutinized. So instead of selling it to the Qatari government, he went on to sell it to an asset management company that the Qatari government holds stake in instead. Before we talk any further about his time in the administration, let me go over a quick relationship timeline between Jared and Ivanka for you guys. So Jared Kushner and Ivanka Trump began dating in 2007, and they would briefly break up because of religious differences. Like I said, Jared Kushner grew up in an Orthodox Jewish household and wanted to maintain the tradition of marrying someone who shares the same faith as him, which Ivanka did not. A few months after the two broke up, Jared and Ivanka's longtime mutual friend, Wendy Dang, who was at the time married to Rupert Murdoch of Fox News, invited them both to a yacht party in hopes that they would rekindle their romance. In 2009, Jared and Ivanka began dating again, and Ivanka began going through the official process of converting from Christianity to Judaism. Later in 2009, Jared and Ivanka would be married on the Trump National Golf Course in New Jersey. In 2011, Jared and Ivanka gave birth to their firstborn daughter, Arabella Kushner. In 2013, Jared and Ivanka had their second-born child, a little boy who they named Joseph Kushner after Jared's grandfather. And in 2016, during the midst of Donald Trump's first campaign, the couple gave birth to their third-born child, another little boy, who they named Theodore Kushner. Anyway, back to 666 Fifth Avenue. Whenever the Kushners were finding themselves really in over their heads and finding themselves in growing debt over this building that they paid way too much for to begin with, Jared was maneuvering and posturing himself in the political world, which he saw as nothing more than a money-making opportunity. And this is where the Qataris and the UAE really come into play. But before we get into that, I want to go through a list of some of the companies that the Kushner family either owns, holds stake in, or operate that are relevant to present day. I'm not going to go through absolutely everything because we will be here for forever. Not every single property and apartment complex needs to be talked about. So after Jared Kushner stepped up as CEO of Kushner Companies, really changed the dynamic of Kushner Companies, Jared was now seen as the head honcho, and his father was really working more so as his advisor. A notable purchase that Kushner Companies made in 2015 in the midst of his father-in-law's presidential campaign was an acquisition of the Times Square building in Times Square, New York City. Jared Kushner authorized that Kushner Companies pay $295 million to Africa Israel Investments to make this purchase. Africa Israel Investments is an international holding and investment firm that is based within the blue and white state. At least since 2008, Africa Israel Investments has been utilizing their money to build illegal settlements throughout the West Bank. And again, this has been since at least 2008, long before October 7th, 2023. Honestly, it was probably happening before that, but the 2008 financial crisis kind of brought a lot of skeletons out of a lot of companies' closets. Africa Israel Investments also builds the for-profit prisons that Palestinian civilians are held in. When the nature of those two major investments came to light around 2009, there was a lot of companies that divested from Africa Israel Investments because it was bad PR. Like even BlackRock divested from Africa Israel Investments in 2009 because of the implications of where their investment money was going. It's BlackRock. Not because they care, but because it's bad press. Africa Israel Investments is still heavily invested in multiple brands, hotels, and properties throughout New York, Russia, Europe, and of course the blue and white state. But it is very interesting to me that the Kushners purchased the Times Square building from Israel Africa Investments. Like, Why did you guys have that to begin with? It's like the Qataris, who own half of Manhattan. In 2014, Jared Kushner went into business with his brother along with a mutual friend of theirs named Ryan Williams, and they created a company called Real Cadre, LLC. It is an online real estate investment firm. And you'll never guess who funded this startup for the Kushner brothers and their friend. None other than George Soros. Yes, the Republican Party's favorite boogeyman. In 2015, while Donald Trump, his father-in-law, was in the midst of campaigning for the presidency, the Soros Management Fund made a deal with the Kushner brothers and their friend to give their startup a credit line of $250 million up front. Now, did Jared Kushner mention this in his conflicts of interest whenever he jumped on board to become a senior advisor in Donald Trump's first presidency? He most certainly did not. The Kushners are also heavily invested in social media, including Instagram, Meta, payment platforms like Stripe. They have an unbelievable grip on the monopolization of social media. Jared Kushner would use that to his advantage to help his father-in-law get elected. So like we just talked about, the Kushners had a lot of investments and have a lot of investments within different social media companies and tech companies. With those investments came a lot of different connections with the Silicon Valley tech world. The Peter Thiels, the Mark Zuckerbergs, the Elon Musks, the David Sacks have those connections with Kushner companies based on the investments they have made. And while Donald Trump was running for president the first time, Jared Kushner leaned on his connections that he made with certain people in the Silicon Valley tech world, including Mark Zuckerberg. So during Donald Trump's campaign before his first term, Jared was the mastermind behind something called Project Alamo. Project Alamo was a team that Jared Kushner created by hand-selecting 100 of the best tech and marketing minds within the Silicon Valley to perfectly shape Donald Trump's messaging online. Project Alamo would primarily utilize Facebook as their target for their campaign. Project Alamo was pushing out hundreds of thousands of ads weekly on Facebook to boost Donald Trump's image. And the success that Project Alamo had was even shocking to the highest executives at Facebook. By the end of their online campaigning for Donald Trump, Project Alamo secured over $250 million of donations from Facebook advertisements alone. Just goes to show you how far these ads were reaching. This was a time when Facebook was still very, very popular. This is really before it became like an unusable social media platform. So basically, Jared Kushner built a professional human bot farm to skew the perception of Donald Trump from the moment that he was introduced as a candidate for the presidency. I'm sure it's just a coincidence, but after Project Alamo, Facebook went through a lot of drama as they got caught for spying on and stealing data and personal information from users. And on top of Project Alamo, Jared Kushner also hired Steve Bannon and his firm to help shape messaging when it came to Donald Trump. And for whatever reason, it was extremely helpful to Donald Trump's campaign, and it targeted just the right audience. Because of that success, Jared Kushner very quickly became Donald Trump's favorite good boy. This seems like a good place to pivot into Jared Kushner's role in the White House during the first presidency and why he got us into such a terrible situation, especially when it comes to our relationship with countries in the Middle East. So after Donald Trump was elected, Jared Kushner stepped into the role of managing his transition team. Jared began writing Donald Trump's speeches and giving recommendations to Donald Trump, many that Donald Trump would take, including Jared Kushner's recommendation of firing Corey Lewandowski, which Donald Trump did. Jared Kushner also recommended that Donald Trump pick Mike Pence to be his vice president, and Donald Trump did exactly that. During Donald Trump's first term, Jared Kushner was effectively the shadow president in the way that Stephen Miller is the shadow president in the Trump 2.0 administration. Jared Kushner was present at every top intelligence briefing. He was briefed daily on security issues, and he had a top security clearance. One of Jared's first major moves while working within the Trump administration was a very controversial deal that he brokered with the Saudis. In the capacity of senior advisor to the president, Jared helped broker a sale that would give $100 billion in weapons to Saudi Arabia. Jared Kushner even worked personally with the CEO of Lockheed Martin to get the best deal for the Saudi Arabian government that they possibly could. Whatever Jared Kushner told Donald Trump to do when it came to multiple Gulf countries, Donald Trump just did it, literally. Whenever Jared Kushner says jump, Donald Trump says how high. And I don't know how many people Donald Trump really does that for. Example, this is kind of goes back in the timeline a little bit, but during Donald Trump's transition into the White House, the head of his transition team was Chris Christie, who was working as the U.S. District Attorney who prosecuted Charles Kushner, Jared's father. And Jared Kushner went to Donald Trump, his father-in-law, and said, hey, you should fire Chris Christie from your transition team. And Donald Trump did it. Like, I don't know if Donald Trump is intimidated by the vast amount of wealth that the Kushners have. I have no idea, but literally, he's like a dog on a leash for Jared Kushner. So the decisions that Jared Kushner made for foreign policy between the United States and the blue and white state, the United States and Palestine, the United States and Russia, the United States and China, the United States and the UAE, the United States and Qatar were constructed and designed by Jared Kushner and put into place by Donald Trump. And right now we are seeing a lot of the consequences for this bad foreign policy decision making that was clearly made with self-fulfilling intentions. We're now seeing the consequences of putting real estate over humanity. So in 2017, Donald Trump appointed Jared Kushner to travel to Palestine and the blue and white state to oversee and facilitate peace talks. And can we just understand what that means? In 2017, Jared Kushner was supposed to come up with a peace plan for Palestine and the blue and white state years before October 7th, 2023. So the United States majorly failed there. And I mean, what did we expect? This is someone who has no experience with foreign relations other than the fact that he was on the precipice of creating a real estate investment empire in the Gulf countries, in the Middle East. And he was already the wrong person to send because Palestinians knew that Jared Kushner could not be trusted, as Jared Kushner very publicly has a long-time family friendship with Benjamin Netanyahu and his family. In fact, Benjamin Netanyahu has even stated that when he comes to the United States, he stays with the Kushners. And throughout Jared Kushner's childhood, whenever Benjamin Netanyahu would come to the United States, he would stay in Jared Kushner's bedroom. So Jared Kushner has grown up looking at Benjamin Netanyahu as almost like an uncle figure. Throughout his childhood and his teenage years, Jared Kushner's been very public that he frequently travels to the blue and white state. So everyone was fully aware where Jared's loyalty lied, and Palestinian people are very intelligent and knew that there was not going to be any real peace brokered by Jared Kushner. Jared Kushner did meet with President Mahmoud Abbas of Palestine in 2017, but Jared did not come to negotiate peace talks, anything of the sort, with the Palestinian authorities. Instead, Jared Kushner and Netanyahu brought the Palestinian authorities a plan that they demanded they accept without negotiation. This deal would have given the blue and white state 30% of the West Bank, a one-time supply of aid to Palestine, no security guarantees for the future, and failure to acknowledge many of the inhumane things that the blue and white state had been engaging in against the Palestinian people. And obviously, if the blue and white state won't admit that they were doing something wrong, they can't agree to stop doing it. It just was a terrible, terrible deal. The Palestinian authorities obviously rejected this deal, as there was, number one, no guarantee that 6 months or a year later, the blue and white state wouldn't come back and want another 30% of the West Bank. Eventually, the Palestinian leadership just outright accused Jared Kushner of purposefully sabotaging any meaningful negotiations or peace talks between the United States and Palestine due to their heavy bias towards the blue and white state, which is exactly what was happening. Skip ahead to 2020, and Jared Kushner, Donald Trump, and Benjamin Netanyahu released plans to create peace in the Middle East, but they only invited representatives from the UAE, Oman, and Bahrain. And though this plan involved an outcome for Palestine, Palestinians were not invited to the negotiations, thus they rejected this peace deal. And also Palestinians were demanding a permanent guarantee that the blue and white state would stop taking land and invading upon and strengthening the apartheid of Palestine. And this peace deal did not offer that. So obviously it was rejected. Anyone in their circumstance would reject that deal as well. This rejection of these peace deals allowed Jared Kushner to begin posturing and publicizing a rift between the Arab countries and Palestine, the blue and white state and Palestine, and position Palestine as not just an enemy of the blue and white state, but an enemy of many other Arab nations. And Jared Kushner really leaned into this. He began brokering multiple different kinds of diplomatic, economic, and peace deals between the blue and white state and multiple other countries. Jared Kushner established diplomatic ties between the UAE and the blue and white state, which he was praised at the highest level, as it ultimately established what is called the first Abrahamic Accord, basically a peace treaty, a historic peace treaty.
He's the father of the Abraham Accords, right? He's the father of the Abraham Accords. And by the way, my granddaughter Arabella, would you stand up, Arabella? She looks so great.
After creating a treaty between the blue and white state and the UAE, Jared moved on to creating a treaty between the United States, the blue and white state, and Kosovo, which is a Muslim majority country. In October of 2020, Sudan and the blue and white state negotiated and signed peace and economic deals led and initiated by Jared Kushner. In December of 2020, Jared Kushner initiated a diplomatic and economic relationship between the blue and white state and Morocco. Later, he negotiated a peace deal between Qatar and Saudi Arabia. Because of all of these deals, Jared Kushner was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize twice. But basically what he did was placate the Palestinians as he was trying to show the public how he could make peace and economic deals between the blue and white state and all of these other Arab countries while leaving Palestinians out of the inner circle to make them seem non-compliant and enemies of peace, as if they are the problem. And it's just shocking to me that Jared Kushner was nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize because his intentions were never peaceful. He was simply trying to intimidate the Palestinians and show how many countries were on the side of the United States and the blue and white state so that they gave up and gave in. But the Palestinians didn't give up or give in, and for that they were punished. They still to this day continue to be punished. So very long story short, and I could keep going, I could give you way more examples. After the Trump 1.0 administration left office, Jared Kushner almost immediately founded Affinity Partners, and Affinity Partners almost immediately turned him into a billionaire. Jared Kushner immediately began investing in companies and properties throughout the blue and white state, the United States, India, Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. Shortly after launching Affinity Partners, Jared Kushner received a $2 billion investment from the Saudi Public Investment Fund. We have talked about the Saudi Public Investment Fund before. Elon Musk was trying to get Saudi Public Investment Fund to invest in Tesla so that he could take it private back in 2018 via a third-party negotiator who was most likely Jeffrey. That deal coincidentally fell apart right around the time Jeffrey was arrested. Just like Jeffrey did, Jared Kushner has a very warm and friendly relationship and friendship with the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Prince Mohammed bin Salman, despite his disgusting reputation. But I guess if you want money from the Saudi Public Investment Fund, you gotta be friends with the prince. Shortly after Jared's new company received $2 billion from Saudi Arabia, he also received a $200 million investment from the UAE. So because of Jared Kushner, for really like the first time in history, investments between the blue and white state, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and many other countries that had not been linked before were flowing freely, which shows you that Jared Kushner made all of those deals on behalf of the United States so that he could later come back and make a ton of money off of them, not actually for the benefit of the United States. I think you guys can see the optics that Jared Kushner was trying to create during his first term, making all these deals between the blue and white state and all of these other Arab nations, or primarily Arab nations, Gulf countries, while leaving Palestine out, how it made it easier for them to shape the narrative that Palestine was non-compliant when really their demands were very simple, and it would allow them to easier shape the narrative for the public to accept the annexation of Palestine. But obviously we did not let that shit go unnoticed. So basically, Jared Kushner set Palestine up for failure while stating that Palestine would be beachfront property. He knew exactly what he was doing. That is pure evil disguised as peace. So when people say Jared Kushner is profiting off of the suffering of the Palestinians, I think it's very clear how he has done that and set them up to suffer while the public accepts it. But it's not just Palestine that Jared Kushner is doing this to. Let's talk about Sudan. So Sudan is actively in a humanitarian crisis, and it is not like a civil conflict the way that it's being portrayed in media. This is a conflict that is funded by outside nations, and millions of civilians are being caught up in the crossfire. So a year after the so-called Abraham Accords were signed, 2021, the president of Sudan was overthrown after 30 years in power by a coup designed by two generals of the RSF, or the Rapid Support Forces. Since then, the RSF has slowly but surely been taking over control of Sudan and leaving a wake of destruction behind them. The mission of the RSF right now and other allied militias is to ethnically cleanse Sudan of Sudanese people, the indigenous people of Sudan, and they are funded to commit this ethnic cleansing primarily by the UAE, but there are other nations funding the RSF as well, but they are primarily funded by the UAE. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, the blue and white state, Qatar, many Gulf countries see Sudan as a very valuable asset, as Sudan is rich in oil and gold. There are a lot of natural resources within Sudan. Because of the lack of stability within Sudan right now, it's very easy for these outside countries to pay militias to ethnically cleanse the land of the indigenous people so they can make way for these Arab countries like the UAE to dominate Sudan and drain Sudan of all of its resources via violence and theft. So the RSF are really these like machines of death because they're coming in and their only goal is to wipe out non-Arab civilians so that these countries that are paying them can come in and take the land and the resources that they want. And the RSF is not like this trained group of professionals who adhere to local or international laws whatsoever. They are coming in and being paid literally to simply slaughter. I'm sure they're being told by the countries that are funding them that they will be receiving something wonderful in return for what they're doing. Like I said, the people who are primarily being targeted are non-Arab civilians within Sudan. And it's like just crazy because like the majority of the RSF are not Arab fighters. A lot of the RSF are people committing crimes against their own people. And the RSF is guilty of some of the most devastating crimes against humanity that I've ever heard of outside of what we've learned about in Gaza. Torture, R-word of men, women, little girls, little boys, babies as young as 1 year old, firing squads, being buried alive, public executions, just really horrific. And this conflict has only gotten worse since the Trump administration cut off all aid to Sudan as it was labeled government waste. So we have a weak Sudanese government, a strong group of fighters who are funded by the UAE, but also the blue and white state, Russia, and other forces as well. We have civilians who have nothing to fight back with and are not being fed because our administration is not allowing aid to go out anywhere. At the very top of it is Jared Kushner, who's actively doing business with the UAE, who is one of the RSF's largest financial backers. Jared Kushner is actively intertwined financially with the UAE and the blue and white state, who are both encouraging and funding or actively imposing the ethnic cleansing of two sovereign nations, Palestine and Sudan. And as both of these atrocities grow worse, Jared Kushner is not leaning out of his agreements and his deals, his profits from these countries inflicting this harm. He's leaning further into them. So while on the outside he looks like a hero for creating all these diplomatic and economic relationships between the blue and white state, the United States, and other Gulf countries, while he's being hailed a hero, in reality he's doing nothing but profiting off of the slaughter of innocent human beings. In present day, as all this goes on, we know that Donald Trump was elected for a second term, and despite the major conflicts of interest, Jared Kushner is back in the administration. Jared Kushner is assisting Steve Witkoff, the special envoy to the Middle East, in his negotiations and peace talks. Remember, Steve Witkoff is a real estate attorney a real estate attorney who worked with Jeffrey's co-conspirators in the past. Hopefully Jared is able to see that we are able to see the game that he's playing, has been playing for a long time now. And I hope people are able to see like the crowd work and political theater that he engages in, the diverting of attention to try to placate other countries to make them look as if they're the underdogs, to make them feel pressure. He's just very crafty at shaping a narrative, when in reality, he is making money off of two of the greatest humanitarian crises that we are watching happening in 2025. So I think it's pretty obvious, because of where Jared sits in the MAGA world within the business realm, that he has quite a few connections to Jeffrey and his co-conspirators. You can find photos with Jared Kushner and Ghislaine Maxwell, Ghislaine's close friend, Carol Radziwill, Harvey Weinstein, so on and so forth. And I mean, obviously we know he married into a family where the patriarch was one of Jeffrey's favorite co-conspirators. One co-conspirator in particular that is tied to the Kushner family that I want to talk about is Leon Black. Recently talked about Leon Black as he is currently facing litigation and being sued by an alleged victim of Jeffrey's ring, who was 16 years old at the time that she was allegedly R-worded by Leon Black at Jeffrey's New York mansion. And this was a victim who had autism and mosaic Down syndrome and was particularly loved by Jeffrey and Ghislaine, as she had very dull little girl-like features. That was certainly not the first allegation that has been levied against Leon Black. Leon Black was also one of Jeffrey's largest clients. Jeffrey saved Leon over $1 billion in owed tax payments due to hiding money in tax shelters and offshore accounts like he did for all his other clients. The Kushner family, specifically Jared Kushner, is in business with Leon Black via Leon Black's Apollo Global Management that he co-founded with Josh Harris and Mark Rowan. And Apollo Global Management owns or holds stake in literally like about everything: real estate, health insurance, life insurance, companies like GNC, AMC movie theaters, Qdoba, Norwegian cruise lines, casinos like Harrah's Entertainment, Michael's Craft Store, Claire's Costume Jewelry, Great Wolf Lodge, One Main Financial, Cox Media Group, Nexstar Media Group, the McGraw-Hill Academic Publishing Company, formerly owned by Robert Maxwell. At Apollo Group, Leon Black has also acquired the Hostess brand, Chuck E. Cheese, ADT Security System Company. They're heavily invested in a private military company called Constellus, formerly known as Blackwater, but it had to be renamed after the Nisour Square massacre. If you don't know what that is, I encourage you to Google it. And that's just to name like a third of Apollo Global Management investments that Leon Black and his co-founders have made. Leon Black's son, Ben Black, is currently working in Donald Trump's administration 2.0. But the Apollo Group is heavily invested in Kushner companies as well. In 2017, while Jared Kushner was working as the shadow president to Donald Trump, Apollo Global Management gave Kushner companies a loan of $184 million. Apollo Global Management is also heavily invested with the UAE. The Abu Dhabi Investment Authority has held a 9% stake in ownership of the Apollo Group since 2007, and the Abu Dhabi Investment Authority is the sovereign wealth fund of the UAE. Very interestingly, as Jared Kushner's connections with the UAE have grown, as well have the Apollo Management Group's grown as well. For example, in September of 2020, Apollo Global Management entered a $5.5 billion real estate investment partnership with the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company. So basically what I'm trying to say is Jared Kushner has direct ties to the UAE, and he also has indirect ties to the UAE. Now, just to wrap things up, I want to talk a little bit about Jared Kushner's brother, Joshua Kushner. Joshua Kushner, like Jared, went to Harvard University, and then he went on to start his own investment company. Like we talked about, Joshua went into real estate business with his brother and a mutual friend, and that was funded by George Soros. But Joshua Kushner would also get into the health insurance company market, as well as the entertainment and social media market. In 2010, Joshua Kushner funded Thrive Capital, which is a venture capital investment firm that has invested in Instagram, OpenAI, Stripe, A24 Films, which he sits on the board of directors of. He's also invested in apps like Vine, Facebook, stuff like that. He founded Oscar Health Insurance in 2012. He attempted to be the face of COVID test manufacturing back in 2020. That never materialized. Joshua Kushner is married to supermodel Karlie Kloss, who also converted to Judaism to marry him. Now the couple owns Bedford Media together, and they are the new minds behind Life magazine. And Karlie and Joshua have 3 children together. As for the Kushners' other siblings, Dara and Nicole, they live pretty private lives out of the spotlight. Nicole's certainly the most involved in the family business. After Joshua in 2017, Nicole Kushner actually, even on behalf of Kushner companies, traveled to China, where she began offering potential investors deals that if they invested $500,000 in American real estate via Kushner companies, would be given a pathway to immigrate to the United States for free. Kind of sounds like that gold card that Donald Trump created. So what is the end goal of this? Without mincing words, for the Kushners to be pleased and to have everything their greedy little hearts want, they will utilize every resource within our government to line their pockets, which will ultimately implicate the United States as a whole in the many crimes that they engaged in to further feed their own greed. Kushners want Palestine as a whole annexed so they can turn it into real estate, plain and simple. He and Netanyahu are aligned politically, which means they are both devoid of morality. The Kushners value happy investors more than they care about the ethnic cleansing that's happening in Sudan. Very simply, life is not the most valuable thing to these people. You know, the party of pro-life, they don't really care about life. 2 of the largest global humanitarian crises are happening at the hands of either their family, friends, or their business partners. That is who our administration is getting advice from when it comes to creating peace in the Middle East. They're talking about what would bring themselves peace of mind, lining their pockets, not what would bring the world peace. Frankly, here in the United States, the Kushners have a notorious reputation of being slumlords. They can't even take care of what they've created here in the United States, and they want to go do the same thing to other countries. The Kushner family profits off of human suffering, while one branch of this family, Joshua Kushner, profits off of movies that portray further human suffering, and it just does not sit right with me. The guy who's decided to starve Gaza is the man who spends his US vacations sleeping in Jared Kushner's childhood bedroom. How can you look the other way while holding out your hand from deposits from nations that are handing you over blood money? And when it comes down to it, when you really think about it, Charles Kushner went to such great lengths to take retribution against his sister for simply doing the right thing, complying with a subpoena, forcing her to be truthful in a federal investigation involving her brother. Because she did the right thing, Charles Kushner tried to destroy her life. These people might look harmless on the outside, but they are full of retribution, anger, hatred, greed, blasphemy, and debauchery, the true scum of the earth. If this administration didn't have a soul while Stephen Miller has been operating as the shadow president, well, Jared Kushner's back. And any sense of humanity existing within the Trump administration is no longer. Okay, that's all I have for you guys right now, but I will see you in the next one.